Seagrasses are flowering plants adapted to life in the oceans. They're the only angiosperms able to live in a saline environment. Seagrasses comprise a relatively small group of plants, with only 72 recognised species from 4 families of the plant order Alismatales. Seagrasses therefore have comparatively low plant diversity, especially when you compare this against coral reefs or rainforests. The wonder of seagrass meadows is that this diversity is counterbalanced by the high abundance and diversity of other organisms occupying the highly productive meadow ecosystems that these plants create. These seagrass plants form seagrass meadows ranging in size and density from small 1 metre squared patches to extensive and continuous meadows covering tens of thousands of hectares. Meadows can be monospecific or comprise multi-species communities with up to 12 species present. In the temperate regions, diversity is limited to only a few species, but is much higher in the tropics. Places such as Indonesia are where we find those really thick multi-species meadows. Just like terrestrial angiosperms, seagrasses are able to flower, they produce fruits and they seed, so therefore they have sexual reproduction, and this is facilitated by the movement of pollen and the movement of seeds and propagules by animals as well as water movements. Although sexual reproduction is key to maintaining diversity and adaptation, seagrasses also utilise asexual reproduction, which is important for meadow growth and maintenance. But where do seagrasses live? Seagrasses are present in shallow seas on the continental shelf of all continents except Antarctica. Their global documented distribution, unfortunately, is largely inaccurate, but estimates range between 160,000 kilometres squared up to over 266,000 kilometres squared. So clearly, we don't know nearly enough about this global distribution. Seagrass meadows are largely present on soft sediment, intertidal to subtidal benthic habitats, and they thrive in sheltered environments such as shallow embayments, lagoons and estuaries, where wave attenuation is limited and light and nutrient levels are sufficient. Depth distribution is largely controlled by the availability of light, with tidal exposure, wave action, associated turbidity and low salinity all being determinants of where seagrass can survive at their shallow edge. Intertidal seagrass is prevalent where there is sufficient shelter from wave action or where there is entrapment of water at low tide, providing protection from exposure. An amazing thing about seagrasses is that they're defined as being ecological engineers. So why is this the case? Seagrass plants are termed ecological engineers. This is because they significantly modify their environment. By attenuating currents and waves, they reduce nutrient levels, decrease turbidity, and thereby enhance conditions for optimal growth. The more extensive the area and denser the seagrass meadow, the greater the capacity to facilitate this positive feedback, ensuring affable conditions. Seagrasses enhance their own survival in sulfide-rich and otherwise toxic sediments by exuding oxygen from their roots into what would be anoxic mud. This action is supported by an incredibly fascinating three-way symbiosis between seagrass, leucinid bivalves, and their sulfide oxidating gill bacteria. This symbiosis results in reduced sulfide stress for seagrasses, with provision of organic matter and radial oxygen release from the seagrass roots for the bivalves and their endosymbionts. So why do seagrasses really matter? Why are seagrass meadows globally important? The benefits that humans derive from seagrass meadows are termed ecosystem services. Some of these services span the global seagrass range, such as water filtration, habitat provision, fish nursery grounds, and biodiversity support. However, local variation occurs in the services exploited and the goods extracted. Their provision of fish feeding and nursery habitat is often cited as rationale for seagrass protection. Indeed, seagrasses provide shelter from predators and provide an abundant food supply, such as small crustaceans supporting much bigger fish stocks. There's growing recognition for the value of seagrass in supporting diverse and productive fauna that creates rich fishing grounds, providing a level of food security in many parts of the world. For example, at low tide, exposed seagrass areas in the tropics provide an accessible human hunting ground for small fish and edible invertebrates. Places such as Indonesia, many parts of the tropics are full of people at low tide out in the seagrass collecting animals with virtually no fishing gear and only the energy of their own legs and maybe a bucket to catch the collection in. At other times of the tides, traps and nets are commonly used to catch predatory fish that migrate in and out of seagrass. Many of the world's biggest fishery species in terms of landed weight are actually closely associated to seagrass. The Atlantic cod, Gadus mohua, is a great example of this. It's the world's third most landed fish species. And this historically important fishery species favours seagrass as a nursery ground, with evidence suggesting that juvenile cod grow faster and have improved chances of reaching maturity when living in seagrass meadows. Seagrass meadows also act as an important filter for coastal water pollution, maintaining the health of fisheries and associated coral reef habitats. From a more cultural perspective, seagrass meadows are also considered important for the value in supporting populations of charismatic species such as green turtle, dugong, and additionally species of seahorse. But many of these charismatic species also have important functional roles within the ecosystem, helping to maintain their resilience. Recent evidence has documented that in the absence of coastal seagrasses, coral reef disease and bacterial contamination of fish species is increased due to water filtration of wastewater. So in those places where runoff of fecal contamination is quite widespread, straight into the water column, then those seagrasses are really playing a vital role. Recently, there's been far greater recognition that seagrass meadows play a significant role in climate change mitigation through carbon storage within their sediments. Estimates suggest that seagrass meadows bury carbon 40 times faster than tropical forests and provide one of the greatest contributions to the total carbon buried in ocean sediments. Because seagrasses are net photosynthesizers and are highly productive, they also rapidly utilize carbon from the water column. This has resulted in considerable attention being given to the role seagrasses play in altering seawater chemistry and potentially buffering a small-scale impacts of ocean acidification on calcifying fauna such as corals and mollusks. But what is the future outlook for seagrass meadows, particularly in a changing environment? The ecological value of seagrass meadows is irrefutable, and yet they remain in decline and largely marginalised on conservation agendas. Action is required to stem the loss of the world's seagrass meadows and to prioritise protection based on their array of ecosystem services. As the human population grows, our impacts on the environment increase. Poor water quality, particularly elevated nutrients in wastewater as a result of poor catchment management together with diverse range of pollution sources, is the biggest threat to seagrasses globally. Water quality problems are particularly acute in developing countries with rapidly growing economies, where municipal infrastructure and environmental legislation are often lacking. Coastal development is a threat, with all the associated activities of boating, tourism, aquaculture, ports, energy projects and housing developments, all placing pressure on coastal seagrass systems. Local and regional threats to seagrass exacerbate the impacts of climate change. They also exacerbate the problems of ocean acidification and sea level rise. Minimising local stress on seagrass will actually support their capacity to remain resilient to the impacts of larger scale, longer term stresses. This means improving water quality, preventing damage from destructive fishing practices, including seagrasses in marine protected area management, preventing high levels of overexploitation of seagrass fisheries, and mitigating stress from coastal development. So to make the changes that are required, bold steps are needed to ensure the recovery and large-scale restoration of these habitats. But the cumulative effect of multiple small-scale actions can work towards a brighter future for these underappreciated undersea gardens.